To get the handle to all go through the stages together, I'm gonna hand sand all the fittings to 320 grit, and then we'll move on to doing the actual museum fit bull nosing. And we're gonna have to do the ends of the handle material, the ends of the ivory, and then we're also doing the part right along the sides where it touches the frame. That all needs rounded over. Put some black marker on there, put the pommel and then the guard assembly back together. And the frame right now barely sticks up over the pommel, and it's gonna have a tiny, tiny bit of a museum fit as well. So I need to round that over at this next stage, just on the metal part. So I'm gonna scribe a little bit of a line on the metal, because it barely sticks up over the pommel. I'm taking a little needle file and lightly rounding over that corner and carefully getting down close to that scribe line. Got all the fittings hand sanded to 320 grit. I went ahead and bullnosed the ends of the handle. So that means I rounded the corner on the mammoth ivory to where it meets up against the fittings. And the reason I do that is so it has that museum fit, or that, I like to just call it a bull nose. Just going over these bull noses with some 600 grit paper to clean up the file marks, and then I'll go over them with some 1500 grit. The rest of the handle is going to get sanded to 3000, but since these bull noses are such a small area, the buffer will buff them up real quick, so I only need to take those to 1500. Well, that looks good. I've got all the fittings hand sanded to 1500 grit. I need to get them heat treated because they're Damascus, and I want them to etch the same darkness as the blade. And in order to do that, we gotta heat treat them. So I'm gonna use some Brownell's non-scaling powder, and I'm using this little trough. I saw ClickSpring do something similar. He made a little trough and put his parts in it.
I've made a custom tray to hold them in. I'm still using boric acid to coat them, but it forms a much more reliable glaze over the top of the parts with this tray.
Got a bed of powder, and then I'm gonna put the parts in here. I'm gonna dust more of the powder generously on top of them. And then we're gonna heat the whole assembly up with a torch just a little bit to get the powder to start melting. And then we'll put a little more powder on to make sure that we got everything covered really well. And then put it in the heat treating oven, heat it up to 1500 degrees, and dunk the whole assembly into my Parks 50 oil. Only one take on this. There better be. There better be only one take on this. Got the fittings heat treated, got them hardened up, went ahead and polished over them a little bit, tempered them in the oven at 425 degrees, the same as the blade, and then did a little bit more polishing, got them etched up, and now I'm in the process of doing the coffee darkening on the Damascus. So I've had the blade and the fittings soaking in an instant coffee mixture overnight. So now I'm going over all the fittings with a sunshine cloth, just a cloth with a little micro abrasive in it, and I'm cleaning off that really thick layer of dark oxides that have built up on the 15 and 20. It's taking away some of the darkness down below where we don't want it to, so I'll probably put these parts back in the coffee and let them soak for a little bit more and then lightly go over them again with this. But I'll do that a couple times until I get the nice amount of contrast that I want in the Damascus. And it takes some messing with to get it just right. You gotta put it in the coffee, do some polishing, put it in the coffee a little less, do some polishing, and keep messing with it until you get it the contrast that you want. I want it really contrasty and I want it really chatoyant at the same time. So I have the best of both worlds. So yeah, I've got a whole bunch of polishing to do on this blade with the sunshine cloth. Just gonna go in there and gently rub on it until I get the 15 and 20 cleaned up. This is the key ingredient in the coffee darkening. The coffee darkening without the sunshine cloth is not good for me, but with the sunshine cloth, it is a perfect match made in heaven. This knife is a takedown, but the handle scales get pinned onto the frame. And since they're gonna be pinned on, I wanna go ahead and epoxy them on too. And that'll give a nice coating of epoxy on the back of them and help moisture not get in there and just help with a lot of different things. So I mixed up some West System epoxy and mixed it up real thick with some colloidal silica in it to make it really thick and strong. And I'm gonna put a light coat on the parts in the frame and get these pieces epoxied together. I've got these handle scales epoxied to the frame, and I've got the blade in there and all the fittings just so a little bit of runoff epoxy doesn't obstruct the tang from going in later. I put some Vaseline on the tang of the knife, so hopefully it won't stick to anything in there. And yeah, this is slow drying epoxy, so we're gonna need to let it sit for 12 to 24 hours or so to fully harden. Be able to take this thing apart, not the handle scales, take everything else apart, put the domed silver pins in the handle, which is kind of a terrifying process because you're using a hammer right next to highly polished, super old mammoth ivory that's a little bit on the brittle side, so that's scary. Do that and sharpen the knife and put it back together again, and she'll be done. I got this handle disassembled from the knife. The epoxy set up over the weekend, and it set up hard. And we're gonna replace those temporary pins with Argentium silver, and it's gonna be domed. So we're gonna use this piece right here. So the first thing I'm gonna do to get these domed pins in the handle is anneal this whole piece of Argentium silver. I'm gonna do that first, and then we're gonna cut them up into little sections that are long enough for each pin. And I need to make them a little longer than we need so we have enough material there to dome a head on each side. I'm gonna put many layers of tape around this to protect it everywhere except for those holes as well. So we're gonna have it over on a little makeshift anvil, and we're gonna be beating on these pins with a hammer. So every once in a while you might miss the pin and hit the ivory. You wanna have a lot of layers of tape there to make sure that the tape absorbs your shock of the hammer and not the ivory, and you don't end up with like a little dent or something. Also, this ivory is kind of brittle, so it's always terrifying to do this because you always are wondering if you're gonna chip out a big chunk or break part of the ivory off or something. But it normally doesn't happen, so keep your fingers crossed for me that it doesn't happen today. Coffee break. Still Colombian. Still Colombian. What I'm doing now is I've got this silver in a little tiny handheld pin vise, and I'm gonna Scotch-Brite the outside of it a little bit on the Scotch-Brite wheel, and that's so I can get these silver pins to fit in these holes. The silver comes just like a couple thousandths of an inch larger than a 16th inch, and it's way less of a hassle just to shave this down a little bit than it would be to get larger drill bits and everything, because I like those 16th inch holes because I can use my regular lineup pins while I'm working on the project. So it only takes a couple minutes. I gotta shave a tiny bit off the outside of this pin until it fits in there, hopefully nice and snug. I've got the first pin fitting all the way through, so I'm gonna take this over and put a bar of metal in my vise to use as a little anvil and just go to town with the ball peen hammer and start making these heads domed. I've got all the silver pins domed into the handle. I made a little tool to help me finish out these pins now. This is just a thin piece of sheet metal, and I drilled a small hole in it that's just big enough to where those pin heads will fit through the hole. Rounded all the edges nice and smooth because I don't want to scratch my ivory at this point. Hold this template over the handle material, over the pins, and use the 3M unitized Scotch-Brite wheel to shape the pins and get them all the same size. They're not very domed or smoothed out, so the Scotch-Brite wheel will kind of magically clean them all up, get them the same size, and round the edges off on them and everything, and then we'll be able to buff them after that. The thickness of your sheet metal that you use for this dictates how high the pins stick up, because I pretty much go down to the sheet metal. Using this with the Scotch-Brite really works well to get them all down to about the same size, and so they're all sticking up about the same amount. Now I'm gonna put green tape over the pins and rub it down really well around the pins, and then take it over to the buffer, and the buffer will buff through the part of the pin that's sticking up, and it'll leave the rest of the tape alone, and that way we can further round them over and smooth out the edges and get them polished up with a nice mirror finish on them. There's one more step to do for these pins. I'm gonna go over it with the same buffing wheel that I used to polish the ivory, which is kind of a soft, semi-loose buffing wheel. And that will just further round out the edges and smooth them up, make sure they're not sharp. And it should clean up that little bit of an edge that was kind of hidden from the thickness of the tape. Got the handle pins all finished in this piece. They're shiny, they're all uniform size and ready to go. Gotta get this blade sharpened up now. I covered the whole blade in green tape, except for the very, very edge of it. I just wanted to be sure I didn't scratch the damascus while I'm sharpening it. And take it in, get it sharpened, and then do some stroping on a block of wood that has leather on top of it, and we should be good to go for assembly. Check the whole edge. Make sure it's all good. That'll do. This fighter is done. Completely, 100% sharpened up. The handle's assembled for the final time. I cranked that pommel nut down so much to where that drill bit was almost ready to break. So it's super, super tight. We've got about an 8.5 inch blade. The handle's just under 5 inches. Mammoth ivory scales, Argenium silver domed pins, 24 karat gold inlay on the pommel and front spacer. It's got a nice wide blade, centered feather pattern, comes out at the tip. That's really important for me. I'll say it a lot, you've heard me say it before, I'll say it a lot more in the future, and it starts out in the center of the ricasso, which is also something I really want to see. You do a feather pattern, you'll impress me by having it start in the center of the ricasso, and then go down the center of the blade or slightly towards the spine, and then come out at the tip. That's what I look for when I look for a feather pattern. That and, you know, the pattern to be even and stuff like that too. Something else I really like about this knife is the museum fit, or the bull-nosed corners. Everywhere the ivory meets metal, the ivory's a little larger and we got that nice rounded corner, and it feels really nice. It adds a lot of texture to your hand, and if the ivory shrinks or expands a little bit, you're not gonna have like a little place where your fingernail can feel metal sticking up. We've got our heat-treated fittings. These things are hardened and tempered the same hardness as the blade. So this knife is a takedown construction, but it's only like a partial takedown. The handle scales aren't gonna come apart. They're pinned on, they're epoxied together to the frame. The whole handle assembly will come off the knife, and this is a type of takedown that I don't make it designing it in a way that the customer is gonna be able to take it apart, because we crank down hard on that pommel nut and some of the pieces fit really tight. Or if the knife ever gets used really hard or anything and it needs cleaned up, we can take it apart and clean it up and do any maintenance it needs on it. So it's kind of a takedown, but like a partial halfway type takedown. Takedown's my favorite construction. I like takedowns. I like pommel nuts. The next project I'm working on is gonna be a stiletto. And I'm really excited about the project because the handle in particular is gonna have something that's a little different than I've ever done before. And I've never seen it done, not saying it hasn't been, but it's gonna be different for me and I'm really excited about that. Thank you guys so much for following along on this fighter build. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.